chapter 10 of Lord of the Flies. In the opening of this chapter, we're very much in the moments of recovery after Simon's murder. Ralph and Piggy fail to see eye to eye, and they really wrestle with the moral dilemma of that murder and trying to understand and come to some level of comprehension in terms of what it means for them and the moral world of the novel. But by the end of this chapter, the boys on the beach have been assaulted by Jack's breakaway group, and we really have that firm final division between the two groups as Jack walks away, referred to now as the chief, with Piggy's glasses in his hand. You then have the three big questions. You have Golding's commentary on authoritarianism, so we need to ask ourselves, how does Golding represent authoritarianism? We need to think about how guilt and trauma are represented in this chapter as our second question. And the third question then is, what is the symbolic significance of the conch and the glasses by this point in the narrative? We will go through, look at a few short key passages in this chapter, as well as some key quotations so that we can track and trace these ideas across the chapter.
Okay, so let's start working through some quotations from across the chapter. We're going to start here. Ralph is cradling the conch and he holds it caressingly. We'll move through to where we see Jack from his left hand dangled Piggy's broken glasses, and in between those two things, as Jack's group assault the boys on the beach, we have the description of Ralph using his clenched fist as a hammer, and in response, the target of his aggression, the face became slippery. So let's start up here. Ralph is cradling the conch and he's holding it caressingly. Well, we certainly have in here a metaphor, and one, to my mind, that represents the way in which democracy must be protected. In this sense, these democratic values are vulnerable to exploitation and damage. But, an alternative reading is that, is democracy being presented as though it's infantile, as though it's childlike? Can it stand up to the violence and aggression of those who would seek to damage it? There is in here the desire for care, tenderness, and these are a radical contrast to the tyranny and authoritarianism that Jack and his group represent on Castle Rock. It's also here something that Ralph prizes. Ralph prizes the conch. Ralph prizes these values, these democratic values. And even if we were making a link towards the end of the novel, the way in which the naval officer thinks that as they're a group of British boys, they could have made a better fist, a better show, the word is used, defending and standing up for democracy and looking after themselves. Now, we have this object being cared for, but it's Piggy's glasses that they walk away with. So we have scientific rationale and order being stolen, being taken away. So scientific, rational and logical thought are being removed. Again, it's important that these glasses are broken, so they've been tarnished being on the island and increasingly exposed to tyranny, savagery and the descent from civility, which is where the boys start off with. They're also seized and captured rather than handed over, and that's a real contrast to the conch earlier in the novel, which we see handed between the boys. So in this sense, we can now start thinking about some themes that we can add in here. So what's going on here? Well, we have democracy and order under discussion. And of course, in this section, these things are under discussion and they're being tarnished, they're being taken away, they're being undermined and ultimately broken down. By the time we come to the this section in the middle, we have again, in the same way that Ralph is deeply involved in the murder of Simon, here we have Ralph using his clenched fist as a hammer. So this simile, Ralph is reduced to a mechanism, so a hammer, mechanical object. This is that creates harm when used improperly. So we have that consideration there. Again, his humanity is ignored, and Ralph's body becomes a tool through which harm and violence is actioned instead. And what's interesting here is there is an avoidance about describing blood. Instead of talking about the face becoming bloody, it becomes slippery. So we're avoiding a discussion about the consequence of violence and its damage. Not unlike the opening of this chapter and that debate that Ralph and Piggy have been engaged in as well. So there is this real determined avoidance to discuss those things. And it's important that this is the middle ground here between these two states, where Ralph is cradling and caressing the conch, and we have that contrast to his violent actions. So we do have that strong contrast between tenderness and violence. It's the potential for evil in humanity. Okay, in this passage here, this is from near the start of the chapter, and in this section we see them discussing, and Piggy and Ralph discussing the impact of the violence that they've enacted, and particularly that Ralph has been engaged in. So we'll just take and highlight some key points here, describing this as the bloody dance, and the fact that, Ralph at that point said, "I don't know what I was." So there's that sense of civility vanishing and going. Okay. It's Ralph who really articulates the impact of that violence. It is not Piggy who's really acknowledging it and able to acknowledging it. And we have Ralph pointing out that he was outside the circle, so Piggy's the outsider again. Despite that, and despite Piggy normally being the voice of rationality and logic, Piggy's determinedly avoiding describing this as a murder and is determined to call it an accident. Okay, and in fact, we have then the first acknowledgement of where fear really comes from in the novel. So this is Ralph, and this is really critical. This is him acknowledging that he's frightened of us. So now they know. Now they know that they now know that the beast is just that dead parachutist, when in fact it is the boys who they should be afraid of. Okay, so it's the boys that Ralph is saying they should be afraid of. So we have this reversal now. It's no longer fearing monsters. The real source of fear in the novel has been identified. It's mankind itself and mankind's potential for evil. And of course, mankind's potential for evil is just as much about mankind's ability to do harm, but also failure to acknowledge. So here we have Piggy in these two quotations describing this as an accident and blaming the bloody dance, as though he's trivializing this death. But of course, this is deeply ironic, as it's in the next chapter that Piggy faces his own mortality and is killed, but this time, with an action that's absolutely deliberate and is absolutely celebrated by and around them. And you also have some moral commentary here. In this section just up here, Ralph absolutely categoric in his definition here. So there is a categoric, certain, definite definition of the action, and there is a clear moral imperative in this section from Ralph. And what's interesting in this section, this is, there's lots of the language of fear going on, which of course has run all the way through the novel, but it's now being applied differently. Ralph talks about not being scared in the process and action of killing him. He talks about not knowing what he was. So again, there is that clear loss of humanity, civility, and decency. And we see lots of times that across the novel, the boys are referenced through either the language of savagery or through references to an animalistic semantic field. Again, the transformation of the boys of members of society, members of civilized society, to base, primal and impulsive beings, inherently becoming inhuman, and their actions become inhumane as well. So again, there is that clear commentary there. There is that coming back to the language of fear as well. And interestingly, this line here that Golding uses, he was gesticulating, searching for a formula. And I think this is a really key little quotation that doesn't get spoken about often enough, in my opinion. And it's something that we'll come back to, is that language fails for Golding to truly capture the true horror of the boy's actions, which is a bit of a move and a shift from this section up here, where the face becomes slippery. So, here Golding is also giving us a little example where language itself is starting to break down and is failing to convey the true horror of mankind and the true potential horror of what man and mankind can do. So we have this passage here just before the assault happens, which I thought was just worth coming to and having a short look at, because we have, first of all, the symbol of the shelters coming back here again. And for me, these serve an important purpose in the novel because they're a reminder of the boys' failure to work together, and the semantic choice of them being battered as well is really significant. The boys' democratic values, their decency, their civility have all taken an absolute hammering by this stage of the novel. And of course, the shelters themselves reflect this, and they themselves are, an inefficient, ineffective protective barrier because they don't and they're unable to protect the boys on the beach from the group up at Castle Rock from assaulting them. But I think, what's also interesting is every now and then we get a little flashback. So in terms of, features and discussing these, we can discuss this one here as a flashback. This is a memory of civilization. And, it's hinted at in the novel that the boys are fleeing a nuclear conflict. So there is perhaps the suggestion from Golding that this is maybe a world that has been lost due to the horrors of war and military conflict. But again, it's worth just having that as this memory of civilization coming through. And this serves as a reminder of what has been lost. This is an idealized world being shown here. And again, that's worth coming back to and highlighting. And this metaphor here, personification rather, the tamed town where savagery could not set foot. Again, this is an idealized world, a world that has been lost to the boys, that they can no longer access as a result of their brutality and of their descent into savagery. Right, let's come back to these big questions. how does Golding represent authoritarianism? Well, you've got a couple of interesting commentaries and bits of development here. You have that discussion, that debate about what constitutes murder and what doesn't, what's an accident and what's not, what is truth and reality. And that's what authoritarian governments do. They make you question your versions of reality, your versions of truth, and what is real, what is true, and what is not. So you have that tension between Piggy and Ralph in the opening of the chapter, and these are two people we wouldn't necessarily think of as authoritarian characters, but authoritarian regimes, because of the actions they enact, the brutality, the violence that are often associated with them, often cause those kinds of debates to then happen. The other aspect and element of this is that Jack and his crew are able to, at will, assault the boys on the beach, take what they want. The fact that they can take those glasses, the symbol of logic, reason, rationality, and take them away, means that actually that reach for logic and rationality has now been ultimately lost. Without logic, without reason, it's harder to oppose authoritarianism. And so, again, that's been another aspect of civil society that's been taken away by the authoritarian figures on the island. And finally, there is no question that by the end of this chapter, authoritarianism is on the rise and is firmly established. It's no longer just an opposing force, it is the dominant force on the island. Now, guilt and trauma. Now, this is really about the response to Simon's death. Piggy doesn't want to acknowledge that it's murder. Ralph does. There's a big gap between them, because ultimately that gap is about whether you're prepared to acknowledge and take on board your own actions and deal with the guilt that goes with that, or whether it's easier just to pass that to one side. Ralph is, this is one of Ralph's better qualities, that he is accepting responsibility for it, and that leads him into the debate around what he was turning into, because he wasn't quite sure, wasn't able to quite find the words. And remember, we had a discussion about the breakdown of language and language not being able to comprehend and really get across what was happening to the boys at that stage, and particularly from Ralph's point of view. From Piggy's point of view, it's almost a moment where he abandons logic and rationality and instead is just seeking to diminish the degree of harm, pain and suffering that happened at that particular moment of the novel. So there is a big gap, there's a big gulf, there's a big contrast between Ralph and Piggy at this point around these issues. And finally, we're just coming back to the glasses and the conch. We discussed when we looked at the quotations that that it's the conch, as we know, represents democracy. The fact that it's being held on to tenderly, caressingly, again highlights all the ways in which democracy is itself really fragile. Inherently, it's very easy to break and tarnish, needs to be taken care of, and there are those interesting, perhaps infantile representations that are being attached to it. Really asking the question: is democracy really the powerful enough to resist the kind of savagery and disaster that Jack and his authoritarian tyranny is imposing on the island? And as we've just said, the glass is being taken by Jack and Jack's group, stress the way in which civility is being, logic, and the logic and reason and rationality being stripped and taken away by those authoritarian figures. So there you have those three key questions. Undoubtedly, you'll be able to add significantly to these, and you can think about these questions both within the chapter and across the novel as a whole.